Welcome to Spinning Back Clique, where each week here at MMA Junkie, we take a spin through the biggest stories in MMA. On this week's docket, never mind all that, because we have huge breaking news. PFL has acquired Bellator MMA. Let's talk about it. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Gorgeous George, and with me, as always, some of the sharpest MMA minds in the biz. Joining me this week goes from MMA Junkie Radio, the creator of SBC, and my co-host on the MMA Junkie Radio podcast. Danny Segura is back. He's down in Miami, and he's got a solid MMA show en Español. Hablemos MMA. Check it out. The Boston shot caller, Nolan King, joins the panel all the way from Beantown. Also, a Best Journalist nominee for this year's World MMA Awards. Producer Cold Coffee's on the ones and twos this week. Let's get started. Oh, man, guys. We finally have some answers that we didn't have about an hour ago, but regarding Bellator's future. PFL has acquired Bellator, and here's what PFL chairman Don Davis said on a post on X, formerly Twitter. Our roster equal to UFC, vote 30%, top 25 world-ranked fighters. PFL launch, reimagined Bellator, Bellator International Championship Series. Mega event for fans in 2024, PFL versus Bellator champs. Panel, react. Nolan, we go to you for the first take this week. And I know, folks, that info is going to trickle in. We welcome you to participate in the chat with questions and comments, and we'll be monitoring that as well. And as we get it, we will divulge because this is tremendous. Go ahead, Nolan.
Yeah, it's a big day for the industry, I think, as a whole, as for MMA. I mean, regardless of where things go from here on out, I think it will be very intriguing to see like a number two powerhouse, what it does for the landscape of MMA. And I've heard differing opinions on this. There's some people out there that say, well, now there's less choices for the fighters, so maybe there's a little less competition. I've heard some people say, oh, PFL is spending way too much money. They're just going to blow through all of this, and then it's going to essentially kind of detonate the non-UFC side of the industry. There's a lot of people that have a lot of opinions about how this is going to go. But I mean, the fact of the matter is we're going to get to see how this plays out. After 6 months of plus of speculation, is this going to happen? Is it not? Weirdness with the Bellator being awkwardly silent about this, multiple seemingly final events for them. Bellator 300 seemed like it was going to be the last one there for a while. Then 301 comes along, and it seems like it's going to be the last one. But we still didn't have answers until today. So it's very interesting to kind of see this all unravel. I think we're in kind of uncharted territory or very rare territory. I mean, we've seen it before with the UFC and Strikeforce and the UFC and WEC, but I feel like all of these acquisitions, mergers, sales, whatever you want to call them, kind of play out a little bit differently. So I'm very interested to see what happens. And I think from a fan's perspective, man, this is about as good of a product as you could imagine. I mean, this is probably the best number two that we've ever, at least the biggest, in terms of talent pool and in terms of some of the names that are out there. And obviously Pride was running pretty concurrently and successfully with the UFC, but I'm not sure they necessarily had, I mean, this is a crazy amount of fighters that are going to be under one umbrella. We'll have to see how much of the roster is going to be trimmed. But for me, I'm excited. I think it kind of rejuvenates both brands a bit to have some crossover. I mean, look at this Friday, right? There's the PFL finals. Now, if they're going to be doing this Bellator versus PFL champions thing next year, we kind of start to think about those matchups. Like there's more implications. Who wins the heavyweight will fight Ryan Bader next year. Whatever. Again, we have to see the timeline of when that event's going to take place. So many details still coming out, but all these things that we're talking about makes things way more interesting than they were yesterday for both of these brands.
Nolan, is this what you wanted, by the way? Because one of my questions would have been, with all the quiet behind the scenes, what's your dream scenario? But did they kind of get it? Did they touch your dream scenario, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Because on one hand, I've always viewed them both as having things that they do very well and some things that they could work on. I think from my experience at Bellator over the pandemic and doing all those events on the ground, it seemed to me that, when things start to kind of shift towards Showtime is when it seemed like Bellator started to fizzle out in terms of the public attention that it was getting. Being behind that paywall that people didn't already have was a big problem. I think also being kind of an umbrella where the people that were calling the shots above Scott Coker were doing so with business decisions, making business decisions based off of a streaming service, based off of more of it being a form of entertainment than actually a fight promotion. I think that caused a lot of issues at times. So for me, that's good. And I think on the PFL side, I think they've done an excellent job. You know, a lot of it is through the money they've been injecting into it. And will they, you know, ever see that come back? I don't know. I can't tell you that all the moves they've ever made, having Wiz Khalifa, you know, do a rap concert at the beginning, whatever, all this stuff. I can't tell you if that sort of stuff is smart. I'm not a business guru on that regard. I think they've done a good job though at putting their name out there, putting themselves on ESPN Plus, you know, putting themselves on all these other channels on social media, things like that, and kind of taking this more business-oriented approach, which can be good and bad. I think times it seemed to fighters like it's just a bunch of suits talking to them, whereas Bellator, Mike Kogan, you know, Scott Coker, Jane Estioko, these are the people they've always dealt with. They're familiar. They've been at their gyms. So there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot that both sides, I think, did well, and I think that they had room to improve on. Like, I think Bellator's talent pool was way stronger than PFL's. Now that they're together, obviously it's not really a competition anymore, but it'll be interesting to see which attributes are taken from each and kind of molded into this new brand that will be PFLator or PFL.
Oh,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you brought that back. I love it.
Yeah.
All right. So we got a few more things to say here. I did want to say one thing. You know, look, the UFC, the story is they were 54 million in debt, and they're a incredible business story. I don't know what PFL's financials are at, but sometimes you do have to lose a little bit of money before you turn it around. We'll see what happens. Danny, Danny, you're next. What's up, man? What do you think? What was your reaction to this news about an hour ago?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to. This is where the imagination goes crazy because, as Nolan said, this is unprecedented. Usually, when we've seen large acquisitions of this caliber, it involves the UFC, whether it's UFC Strikeforce, UFC WC, and the story kind of is the same, right? Like they're just gonna acquire the talent, run the promotion for a little bit, then disband it, right? In this case is number 2 or number 3, whatever you want to call it. It's either 2 or 3 or 3 or 2 acquiring each other and actually making a run at competing against the UFC. I always thought that having more options is better. And I think in a vacuum that is true for the fighters, for everyone. Less options anywhere, it's usually not good. However, when you talk about competition, sometimes there's a saying, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So in this case, joining forces with Bellator or acquiring Bellator and acquiring its roster, and all of a sudden you have a lot more options to play with, because certainly you could make a case that Bellator was number 2 or PFL number 2. They're neck and neck. They both got great things going on for each other. So if you're able to combine both of them, I don't think it will surpass the UFC, but I do think this. The UFC has spread itself way too thin in recent years with so many events where now we're going head-to-head some weekends, and PFL or Bellator might have a better card than a UFC Apex show. Now it just comes down to promotion, right? Can you get your event front and center so everybody knows about it? Because everyone's going to remember those 3 letters. But it's already a fact that these promotions have been able to compete sometimes with the UFC. Now they're going to combine powers. Of course, they're going to run independently, as the press release said, at least for some time, and maybe we'll see a merger down the line. But still, the fighters are going to be available to cross-promote and to do event versus event fights. So it's going to be very interesting. I think this is all unprecedented. I think this is the strongest number 2 we've had, at least in recent times. And before, I think Strikeforce at some point was a way stronger number 2 than now the merger of PFL Bellator. But UFC had so little events that it was hard to compete. Every freaking weekend, the UFC was always going to have a better event, even if you had Overeem, even if you have Fedor fighting, and these were prime days for these guys and a bunch of other names as well. But in this case, I'm really curious to see if PFL does things right in the sense of working around the calendar. There's going to be weekends or many weekends, at least on paper, where there shouldn't be a good reason why the PFL and Bellator promotion wouldn't have better events than the UFC. Let's be honest, UFC still number 1, but some of these Apex shows are not the greatest. So I'm very interested to see how this turns out. I think what Nolan mentions is also very, very true. I think there's some fear in the industry about if PFL doesn't play its cards right, you can just implode, and all of a sudden there is no number 2, there is no number 3, and that could ultimately be worse for the industry. Only time will tell, but I am someone that's relatively optimistic, at least most times, and I like some chaos. I believe that, within chaos, within change, there's opportunity for bigger things, for nicer things. So maybe this is it. Maybe this is what we needed. Somebody to step up and double down and try to go after the UFC. We'll see. I'm very, very excited. Part of me a little bit worried as well, but overall just very excited and fascinated about this whole thing.
Man, 2 perfect words to end that with, Danny. Excited, fascinated. Like, this, I don't know, this gave me a little injection even more. I'm always fired up for SBC, but I'm just thinking of the possibilities. And folks, excuse us if we look away. The news just keeps funneling in, so we're going to update you as much as we can because we're with you for the next hour or so. Please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us, obviously, to grow the show. So right now would be a good time. I just ask that humbly. It really, really helps trigger an algorithm on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Well, subscribe basically puts you on this channel, and I always stand by the quality content that we have. Let's go to Goes, man. Goes, same thing, man. What was your reaction when you read those words? We finally had some answers.
That's the thing. It's so funny. That's what's so funny about the situation is we have the answer to probably one of the biggest questions, but all it did was give us more questions, right, that we're looking to be answered. And there's so many different avenues that we can go with this type of scenario. And I like what Nolan and Danny both said. I think they're things that we need to definitely look out for. I'll add a couple things too is, you have something like Dana White's Contender Series, right? And all these people trying to get on those cards. Who knows? This is going to be a lot of cards they're going to need to fill. That could maybe create another avenue for those fighters. Like, I'm very interested to see how the fighters are actually taking this, because maybe one less option disappeared, but at the same time, this one seems so much stronger now that I think you do want to be a part of it. As far as them competing with the UFC, I think it's going to take some time for something like that to happen. Everybody wants to compare UFC and Pride, and those two situations were very different. And for quite a long time, Pride was the number 1 guys. Like, if you looked at certain divisions, they had the top dogs, and it was the UFC kind of trying to compete with those guys. So it's going to take a minute to ever get to that point, but they are going to have competition as far as what we want to watch on the weekend. Because Danny's right. Sometimes some of these Apex cards aren't that strong. We're just kind of sitting there waiting for that main event. And if they can take advantage of those types of weekends and put on something that we want to see, then it might take away some viewers. But there's just so much. Like, I mean, think about the influx of talent from Bellator that's going to come in divisions that the PFL doesn't have, right? Just seeing Kayla Harrison and Cyborg and under the same umbrella now. There's just so much things that can happen here. I really hope PFL kind of not put your foot on the brakes, but just really do this right. Take your time and do it right, because you could do something very big in our industry for the fans, for the fighters. Great matchups that are coming up, and I'm totally down for this, man. I think this can be a little bit of what Danny said, like a fun chaos.
Oh, yeah. All right, well, here's a few things that I wrote down from the press release that was sent out, from the tweets that have been coming out. Paramount apparently still keeps a minority stake. I don't know the percentage, but there's something there. Similar to, I guess, the Fertitta brothers and Dana White. I think they held on to something before they got turned over to Endeavor. Scott Coker and the team, according to Brett Okamoto from ESPN, they get to stay on board if they would like. And I mean, that WMMA roster, you got to think about that. Their stance is ours is better than the UFC's right now, and they may have an argument. I don't know. That's up for debate. I think in some of the weight classes, yeah. I think you guys actually are correct, PFL people. 8 events scattered throughout 2024 with Bellator MMA. It's kind of going to run on its own, I believe, and that's maybe what Don Davis was alluding to. He called it, let's see here, what was it? Bellator International or something like that.
So looking at Don Davis, this is again where I say like they're kind of more business savvy. If you look at Don Davis's LinkedIn post recently, he said that there's going to be 5 franchises, is what he's calling them. So there's the PFL League, the PFL Pay-Per-View Series, the PFL Challenger Series, the PFL International League, and then Bellator will be its like 5th franchise. So kind of a little bit of everything that we've seen from them, and then just Bellator will run concurrently in its own I think, what did it say, 8 events per
Yeah, they get 8
international
and
champion
total
series.
will be 30 for all of PFL, for all of those franchises you wrote. So yeah, like I say,
they're gonna have 8 events. You said Bellator.
Yep.
Yeah,
It's
because there's
interesting, though.
existing contracts that need to be fulfilled.
course.
You know,
Yeah.
when there's these types of negotiations. So I imagine 2025, I don't know, will probably look different from 2024. But Nolan, I think you had a little bit more info on that on that topic, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen it before. Again, like history has shown, but yeah, with this one as well, it seems like part of what made this deal, I don't want to say it's what delayed it or anything, but one of the trickier things I think when it comes to this sort of merger or acquisition is all those sort of business deals, right? Deals that you might not even as a consumer or a fan really think about. You probably think about fight contracts. You probably think about maybe you do recognize a little bit. We've seen it more with the UFC recently with like arena deals and partners overseas and stuff like that. But I think when you have all these advertising deals, when you have production deals overseas, things like that, there might be contracts that have to be fulfilled, right? So how do you do that? You end up having to run this brand kind of simultaneously, and probably in a way that will fit the PFL brand's needs. Like, you know, I'm sure we saw in the UFC, right? They started to kind of, with Strikeforce, they started to take some kind of pluck some of the people out of Strikeforce as they needed them and throw them in the UFC. And then eventually kind of the well dried up with Strikeforce, and that the ends were tied up there, and that was it. So I'm guessing that's what is going to go on with Bellator. Again, this is all sort of developing new stuff that we're getting literally as we speak here. But I will say something just kind of hitting me talking about all this is like, how like, imagine 4 or 5 years ago when World Series of Fighting rebranded into PFL, right? And they were doing a couple one-offs randomly. I think they did one outside somewhere in like Washington or something, and they had this, it might have been raining, or I remember watching it like and being like, man, I don't know how this thing still kind of exists, right? And then here we are. They have obviously dumped. There's a ton of money that's been pumped into it. Again, I can't speak one way or another about how much, there might be some people that look at that as a bad thing. But for me, it's like, man, they just came into the industry as a brand that really seemed like it was going to fizzle out. They were on Versus at one point. And somehow over the span of a few years, they scored an ESPN deal. They made themselves relevant in certain ways by associating them in the same, on the same streaming service as the UFC, signing big free agents, doing something a little bit different. I mean, I think everybody there kind of deserves a lot of credit for this, because even when Don Davis's name started getting brought up at Bellator events, I remember the vibe there was kind of like this is kind of maybe a little bit for clout. And I don't mean that like from the people that even worked at Bellator. I mean, just kind of like the media. It was almost like when maybe the UFC's brought up at a Bellator event, you kind of see like, okay, like somebody's kind of grabbing upward to get a little bit more attention. And I felt like that was what was going on with PFL. And man, I was wrong. Like here we are a couple of years later, and Don Davis, Peter Murray, Ray Sefo, Greg Savage, all those guys like deserve a good amount of credit for kind of taking over the side of the industry that's not the UFC in kind of improbable fashion. So this is a big experiment overall, and I think whether it's good, whether it's bad, the ending we'll find out. But to actually see it be able to play out, this thing that people have always talked about as having some sort of real or semi competition to the UFC will be fascinating over the next year or so.
Hey, how about this, guys? I was just sitting here thinking like, well, who are the biggest winners in this announcement? I have to imagine Chris Cyborg having the chance of possibly facing Kayla Harrison. When you think about how many belts she has and her constant battle of being compared to Amanda Nunes, adding another belt, a PFL belt, that's pretty big. And how about Ryan Bader, right? He might be the winner of the Francis Ngannou sweepstakes here. And we all know that comes with a huge payday.
I don't know if there's a winner there, but sure.
That's true.
Yeah, no, good points, Goes. And you know what's funny is as you guys have been talking, I know there's going to be some negativity, there's going to be some positivity, but let me just throw this at you guys. I believe it was season 1. John Anik commentated for Bellator. Now he's with the UFC. Jorge Masvidal was on an early season of Bellator, and I think he even got triangled, and Tobi Amata, who triangled him, got the sub of the year for the World MMA Awards. And then now Masvidal, arguably when he retired, was the UFC's biggest active pay-per-view star. I say that because McGregor was sidelined with the injury. So many things can change. I brought up the UFC being 44 million in debt, 54 million in debt with the 10 million they invested in season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter, and look at the way that changed. So, folks, a lot can go down, and if anything, I give the PFL credit for, at least if they are going to go down, which I'm not hoping that they do, they're going down swinging. They're throwing kitchen sinks, everything imaginable. But you should be excited about this because, look, yes, we don't want a monopoly. We want competition. It's always great. But Bellator was slowly dying. I hate to say it that way, but that's exactly what was taking place. And now I think both franchises have been rejuvenated one way or another. All right, I'm going to read some comments, and that'll give the time for the guys to refresh, see what's come in. And then, guys, I want to zero in on a specific part of the tweet that I think we should get excited about. And let's maybe start doing a little bit of forecasting, having a little bit of fun, because that's really what it's all about, right, guys? The fights. But look, Chris De Santiago says, let's go. He's fired up. Don Harden says, big news, great timing. You're right, it is great timing because it happened right as we were pretty much dotting I's and crossing T's and squiggling Q's right before the show. Joseph Boza, though, his take is this is a slow death for Bellator. I don't think Don Davis really wants Bellator. If I'm a fighter's agent for Bellator, I'm exposing UFC and or other places in 2024. Iron, Fabian Steele. Yo, let's go PFL. He's down. Green, 49-285. Big news, boys. A few super fights. And that can happen and a few more chances to gain some serious traction in the MMA game. Colostrum, he's even thinking outside of the box, he or she. What will happen with elbows? Well, they're all different franchises, so no elbows probably during the regular season of PFL. I'm sure elbows will be allowed in Bellator. We don't know. We want answers to these questions too, but I like your outside the box thinking. Finally, Daniel MMA says, awesome show, fellas. Keep up the good work. I wish they would just combine the two organizations and not run events separately. That could very well what happens in the long run, Daniel. But like I said, when you acquire huge companies like that, stuff is already set in place. And so maybe that's just the way things work out in 2024. And it could be very, very different in 2025. But yeah, we're all dreaming just like you, which is what I want to get to. And by the way, keep that stuff coming in. I'll try and scroll and get to as many as I can. Obviously, the better the way the question is presented, the better the questions, the more likely it is for us to include it. Also, one more time, hit that like and subscribe. It does a lot to blow up the show.
You're not going to read Ryan Thibault's comment here, George? He said you got enthusiasm similar to when Buddy the Elf sees Santa. I think that's fantastic when you talk about MMA.
Okay, I don't know who that is, but thank you if that's good. Yeah. All right, guys, let's zero in on this part. Don Davis said, mega event for fans in 2024. PFL champs versus Bellator champs. So I'm going to throw some names at you guys. All right. Clay Collard faces Olivier Aubin-Mercier this Friday. The winner versus Usman Nurmagomedov, who at this point I know is serving a 6-month suspension, but I haven't heard anything about him getting stripped. But what are your thoughts there? I want to know what your guys' early leans are in terms of who, that might be the best answer to who was the number 2 or the number 3. What do you think, Nolan? Who do you like in that? Usman Nurmagomedov or the winner of OAM versus Clay Collard?
I mean, I think this is the thing for me is like I've always I don't like to speak in absolutes. I've made the argument a lot of times that I've always felt Bellator had the better talent. So I would have to break down each of these matchups, but I think to me like the early lean on that one would be Usman. I think Usman is certainly one of the stronger pound for pound fighters that Bellator has right now. And as we're speaking, I'm reading something from Aaron Bronstetter where he's talking about the PFL season will consist of the same 6 weight classes this season, and then the Bellator International Champion Series will have all weight classes. So I wonder what they'll have to do beyond that, because I think if you use the same weight classes, if they were to continue the same weight classes in 2024 as 2025, you would end up having some good Bellator fighters kicked to the curb there. So Sorry, I'm just processing this all as we go along here. But to answer your question, yeah, I think I would lean towards Usman. But again, this is what makes it fun. This is why this announcement coming this week, I think, was fantastic. I'm not sure how long they've been sitting on this for either. Like, was this done 2 months ago and they were waiting for this finals week to announce it? Possible, but the fact it got done before the finals, we get to hype up matchups like this and kind of start to get the gears turning.
Goes. How about this one for you? The winner of Renan Fajeda and Dennis Goldsloff against Ryan Bader.
Yeah, I gotta lean Ryan Bader in that one. But I'll tell you this much, George. Just going back on the previous question, one thing we do have to remember, OAM kind of had one foot out the door. And I think possibly this type of news, these types of new fresh matchups might be something that keeps him around. If he's the guy that has to face him, then I think that matchup's a little bit more competitive. But there's just so many different things, so many different scenarios here that we could have fun with this all day, man.
Danny Segura, the winner of Impa Kasanganay and Josh Silveira against Vadim Nemkov.
Vadim Nemkov. I do think that Bellator has the better roster. One, they just have more fighters, and two, I think they just have fighters that, in terms of talent, have proven to be elite. They have really, really good roster. PFL does have a good roster as well, but I think in terms of firepower there, Bellator takes the win. The only thing that PFL has been much better at Bellator, I think, especially in recent years, and a lot of it has been circumstantial. Nolan talked about this a bit, has been promotion, getting Wiz Khalifa. I think Jake Paul has done wonders. Francis Ngannou, who hasn't even fought, has just been a huge promoter of the PFL at this point, with everything that he's been doing in boxing. And just the fact that they're on ESPN Plus, like the MMA fan doesn't have to buy an extra subscription with Showtime in order to consume MMA. And we already know they're consuming UFC. So, yeah, now I just think that all this great stuff that we've been seeing at Bellator can now be even promoted more, which is they have a lot of talented fighters. In fact, fighters that have gone over to the UFC eventually, like Eddie Alvarez, and others that have either become UFC champions or challenged for UFC titles. So this is exciting. This is exciting.
All right. Well, I'm not going to let it go. I want to see if this is going to be a sweep or not. Jason Jackson. We're back to Nolan. Jason Jackson versus the winner of Magomed Karamov and Sadabusi. Who do you like there?
I have to see after Friday. I think Magomed Karamov can look kind of inconsistent at times. Like, there's been times I've been like, man, this is one of the best fighters that they have in PFL. But then sometimes he'll put out kind of a flat performance. So I guess we'll have to see what happens Friday. Jason Jackson, I feel like can't pick against him at this point just because of what he did on Friday. I felt like he was kind of the forgotten guy on that card coming after, not only in a fight that was after Patchy Mix versus Sergio Pettis, but also going against who many people believed was one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in Bellator, which is Yaroslav Amosov. He went out there and just absolutely from the opening bell was in control of the fight, got the finish early. So, again, man, I still lean with Jason Jackson. I'm less confident with that pick just because I feel like that performance on Friday was a bit shocking and showed a whole nother level of him that we haven't seen. But close fight.
Two things. Cold coffee's always on the money with those with that B-roll, and great reffing by that ref. I know it was in slow motion, but man, he took a look at great angles and then jumped in at the right time. And Jason Jackson, we're going to give you some love in just a second. We do have a segment dedicated to Bellator 301. It's just that we're unpacking this news here. All right, goes last one. Patricio Pitbull versus the winner of Jesus Pineda and Gabriel Alves Braga.
Ooh, that's a tough one, man. Pitbull's going to go down as one of the greatest Bellator fighters of all time. Pineda's been on fire, dude. I'm gonna go. I'm still gonna go Pitbull just because he's just such a tough out, man. I'm gonna go him. But I do want to ask you guys a question now. I'm gonna flip it on you. Obviously, Bellator versus PFL champs, that's fire. But does it come with a price? If Bellator comes in and mops the floor with the PFL fighters, does that make them look bad at all? Is that because remember when the WEC came into the UFC, if you look at some of those top dogs, like they came from the WEC, some of the guys that reigned for quite a long time.
I'll answer. Can I answer that, Goes, or is it panel only?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
About 10 years ago, RFA and LFC had a showdown in Mississippi. So now you guys know it as LFA. They combined. It was Resurrection Fighting Alliance versus Legacy Fighting Championship. And so that's where Mick Maynard came from, the UFC matchmaker. He owned LFC, and Ed Soares, longtime manager for many Brazilian fighters like Anderson Silva, he was RFA. And something that actually was birthed on MMA Junkie Radio happened where the two promotions collided. And RFA, if I'm not mistaken, beat them 4-1. Mick Maynard and Ed Soares could not have been better. Sportsman's about it. They shook hands, 4-1. You know what, Goes? It could go 5-0, 4-1. It'll answer our question for about a week, and then it won't matter because it's all under one umbrella. So it'll be interesting, but I don't think it'll really matter too much. But it does appear that you guys kind of nailed it. Bellator probably deeper roster, maybe the actual better talent at the top. However, I think PFL was just the more innovative promotion in the last few years. And so from that end, I think they were the number 2. But I want to box you guys into a corner here. This one's the tough one, guys. You guys ready? Nolan, we'll start with you. You're with PFL, all right? And Scott Coker goes, "What's up, bitch?" Right, to you. And he goes, "I got Cyborg."
As he's
and
known
shoves
to
her
do.
in there. Who are you shoving into the smart cage, Pacheco or Harrison?
Who is it for Cyborg?
No, yeah. So Coker goes,
Yeah. Oh,
here's
you
my
have to- I mean-
fighter, Cyborg. And then he turns to you, Nolan, and goes, "Who are you throwing in there with the PFL? You know, repping the PFL. Are you throwing in Kayla Harrison or Larissa Pacheco?"
I mean, if they're doing it on the merit that whoever wins the championships this year get a title fight against the Bellator champion.
Who are you?
None of this face right.
Who are you
right
putting
now,
in
who are
there?
you-
I mean, it
who
has
you
to be
feel
the
more
Harrison
confident
fight.
to bang
It has to
against
be the
Cyborg?
Harrison. Oh, I see what you're saying.
You want to win, yeah. You don't care
I
about
think it would have to
you
be.
want to
I
win.
think it would have to be Harrison just based on the styles there, right? Like I don't think Larissa Pacheco is going to out Cyborg, which would be, I think, her strong suit is kind of to give that sort of aggressive offensive attack. So for me, I would have to go with Harrison. Plus, we get the fight that I think people want to see. So,
Yo, do
Danny
you think
Segura,
PFL
it's
now has the
3-3?
biggest women's fight available in Cyborg versus Harrison, or can the UFC make a bigger fight among the females?
it's a
Nah.
fair point.
They might have
Yeah,
the
I
biggest
think-
women's fight on their hands, right?
They might,
especially with years previous of buildup behind it too. Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Yeah. By the way, Danny, thanks for messing up my set here. I'm in the middle of a set, but that was a fair question. That was solid. But Danny, it's 3-3. Coker shoves in Cyborg, right? And this is game 7 right here. Who are you shoving in, Pacheco or Harrison?
Harrison, because if I'm a promoter, I want to make money, and that's the fight that
No,
sells.
you want to win the series. This is a World Series. This isn't about money.
Prize
or
fighting, my
views and-
friend. Got to get those
Man,
pay-per-view numbers.
I think I thought the hot hand would be Pacheco. She
Really?
can throw hands, guys, just
Yeah,
as good
no,
as Cyborg.
Pacheco is
not as
definitely a
good as
solid
Cyborg.
option, and that's definitely a fight that I want to see, and I hope that it does happen. That'd be huge for
Yeah.
Brazil, and also like that is a really good fight. Pacheco has evolved a ton, and I do think she's elite. I think she's among the best in the world right now. But you got to throw Harrison in there. I mean, that's just the sexier fight, the biggest fight. And on top of that, like as Nolan mentioned,
He is the bigger fight.
no
for sure.
one apart from the GOAT, Amanda Nunes, has been able to outgun Chris Cyborg. So I don't have much faith on anybody outside of Amanda Nunes. And obviously Harrison's tough as shit. She's got some striking, but that judo and that grappling is where it's at. So I'll go with Harrison. I'll stick with Harrison.
Is it unanimous,
Look at
Goats?
this. The
Okay.
women's featherweight division just absolutely thriving. Exactly the sort of conversations and debates we were expecting to have at the end
I
of
mean, this is what they
2023, right?
want with the acquisition, right? Like this is
Totally.
this is exactly the goal. All of
Yeah.
a sudden, like there's a whole sea of possibilities, and this is very exciting. And I was just looking at the rosters, and dude, Bellator has a sneaky good roster. Like, and I'm just like kind of daydreaming now about certain fights. Imagine like Patricio Pitbull versus a Clay Collard, or a Shane Burgos, and you go and you throw Patricky Pitbull in there, the brother. I mean, those are bangers. There's a lot of good fights.
AJ McKee
Yeah.
at featherweight or lightweight.
Mhm.
That
Aaron
dude's
Pico.
20-1 in Bellator. 21 overall is just impressive. But I mean, that guy's got Bellator written all over him. Goes, how about you? You go with Harrison too? Just for my silly question.
I go with Harrison too, but it is rather close. But I think what it comes down to is I just don't think Pacheco can outbox Cyborg. At least Kayla gives us a little bit more of a different dynamic, a different attack.
Mm-hmm. All right, good stuff, guys. Look, we'll circle back because this is huge news, but let's blast through some of the other stuff that we wanted to talk about. Unless one of you's got something we need to tackle right now, because I know stuff keeps popping up. Anything? Last check, real quick.
No, I was just thinking about how it will be interesting to see kind of the experimental projects too, like Clarissa Shields, Jordan Oliver on the Bellator side, the Jake Paul thing coming into the mix. Like now that there's a clear number two, and we'll see if they integrate some of the Bellator folks on the higher ups over to PFL. But I feel like the possibilities of some of those longer term development project sort of fighters will be very fascinating to see now that those two brands are together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the chat, Joseph Boza, Larissa Pacheco exposed Kayla Harrison. Brian Williams says, "Hello, folks. Hello, Brian Williams. How you doing, man?" Kepsta says, "Cyborg is getting older. Pacheco can do it, and she is now the one that can send Kayla Harrison to go and work her game." Donnie GZ says, "AJ fits in perfectly." Everyone in the chat is excited about all the possibilities. McKee versus Burgos. Let's go, according to Green. 49-285. That would be a great fight. Pacheco versus Cyborg would be an actual fight, according to King James. Heavyweights. What would be some good matchups? Francis versus, well, we kind of covered that. Either the winner of Goldsoft and Fajeda, or let's just get going with Ryan Bader. I don't know. I want to still see Bader versus Linton Vassell, and I think we might eventually get to that before. Who knows? I don't know. PFL is pretty innovative and crazy. I don't know if they go outside the box or what. What we know is Bellator is going to run 8 events in 2024, and imagine their champions will be featured. What was that thing, guys, in the press release about the co-champions will be featured in certain types of fights? That's where they started to lose me a little bit. Between Don Davis's cryptic tweets or posts and that press release, I felt like The Exorcist in my head was spinning all the way around. Could anyone figure that one out?
You talking about the co-main event? They were saying would be a quality one or something on those Bellator cards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think what they're saying is that there'll be 2 Bellator title fights that will co-headline, like they're both the same level on each of those shows.
Okay.
I don't know.
They would have been better off just scratching that and just going, things are going to be nutty in 2024, fellas. All right. Anyway,
right.
Let's move on here because other stuff did go down this past week. And Brendan Allen, he called for a 185 title eliminator. So that's his weight class. After submitting Paul Craig. Should he get it? How should the top of the middleweight division be sorted out now that we do have that title fight that's been set in January with Sean Strickland defending against Dricus du Plessis? Danny, what do you think, man? Is he jumping the gun here a little bit, Brendan Allen, or does he have a rightful claim?
No, he has a rightful claim, man. I mean, he's killing it. He's on an impressive win streak. What is it, like 5 or 6 at this point? And he's just been running through the competition, really. Like he ran through Paul Craig. I mean, it just felt throughout the entirety of the fight that it was just a matter of time when he was going to get the finish. It wasn't if he was going to finish, it was just when. And he's clearly proven that from about top 10 to top 15, that's fairly easy work for him. And I think that's pretty clear at this point. And that's why we need to see him against a higher ranked opponent. I do think he's 1 win at most, depending on who he fights. At the very least, I think probably most likely 2 away from fighting for the belt. But I certainly think he deserves a big step up next, whether it's a top 5 fighter or a former title challenger. So I'm down for a Brandon Allen, Jared Cannonier, a Brandon Allen, Hamza Shimaev. I'm down for a Brandon Allen, Marvin Vittori. Any of those guys, I think it makes sense. But he definitely needs a step up in competition. I mean, clearly, we're seeing it. He's stopping all his opponents.
Yeah. All right, Goes. How about you, man? You share the same sentiment as Brendan Allen, who feels like he might have a title eliminator fight next, or is he still kind of stuck a little bit behind other title challengers?
I think a lot of it has to do with the landscape and what's going on, right? Like Shimaev and his injury. But I'll say this much, man. That was one of the better performances, top to bottom, I've seen in a very long time. He looked comfortable all week. He goes in there, he does great in the fight, he gets the finish, and he maximizes his time behind the mic. And that's so important for him to make these type of call outs, to say the things that he says, and then have people like us on Monday talk about that. That is such an important aspect of your job, if you're a mixed martial artist. And sometimes fighters don't take advantage of that, right? They just say, hey, whatever the UFC wants. But this is what gets us talking. This is what gets us throwing names out there. Me personally, I kind of like the name Paulo Costa. I don't know that I mean, I really do like Chimaev, but I just don't think they would put those two together. But I think Paulo Costa is something that maybe they could do and get those guys going again. But personally, I think if we have this conversation a year from now, dude, we're talking about Brendan Allen possibly being a champ. Like this kid's got it. But there are so many intangibles in this division, so many things that can happen at any moment. Israel Adesanya could raise his hand and go, I'm back. I feel like going again. And that flips everything upside down. But I think the UFC should be ecstatic. I think they have a star on their hands.
Yeah, and beating Costa is beating a name. And that's the trick about along the way. You want to beat someone that puts you over even more, even though he's doing very well on his own. I think winning 8 of his last 9. Nolan, how about you, man? Is it too soon? Or is he spot on? The next one should be a title eliminator.
I lean towards thinking it's a little too soon, but at middleweight, I think middleweight's one of the hardest divisions to look good at and really impress, just because it's kind of the balance between like being a heavyweight and just kind of doing what you need to do to get by and having some power, but in some technique, and you kind of meet in the middle. But Brendan Allen had a great performance on Saturday. I'm just not sure I'm willing to go that far, but I think there's a matchup where it would kind of be left up to him, right? And that matchup's Robert Whittaker. I think if you go out there and you look good against Robert Whittaker, another 5-round fight, hopefully, then yeah, you could potentially, regardless of who you are at this point in time, you could establish yourself as a guy that's next in line for the title. So Brendan Allen, for Brendan Allen, it's a high risk, high reward situation. For Rob, I think this is a fight to really gauge where he's at. Kind of I don't want to call it a reset fight because Allen's obviously tough, but in terms of rankings, in terms of name recognition, it would be a little bit step back from what he's used to. So I think it would be a good fight for both guys.
Yeah, man. Those are high risk, but high reward fights. And I think of O'Malley versus Peter Yan, huge for him. And Dricus du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker, huge for him, you know, and so something like that might even be his best bet because Bobby Knuckles is, I mean, former champ, all respect, but he does seem to be that gatekeeper to that top position, which is a title challenger. Real quick, just one of the three of you. Does any of you know, has anyone been anointed the alternate for UFC 297 in Toronto, Canada, Strickland versus du Plessis? Is there a middleweight out there who's already been anointed that? Do you guys know? And would Brendan Allen, would that be a good spot for him? Maybe sometimes that guarantees you the title shot. Other times you just keep the seat warm for someone else.
I think it's never a bad spot to be in.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, Cannonier was the backup a couple for the title fight, Izzy versus for Strickland, and so who knows? I mean, sometimes it's kind of weird, right? Like the UFC doesn't always go with the guy that you would think necessarily would be the next one in line. Like we obviously saw it with Gamrot, right? Like they had him as the backup, and then they're like, oh well, you know, now we actually need a backup, so we're going to take a different option, you know. So it's a weird balance there, but I think Cannonier would be a good one if he's still down to do that all over again, if he's kind of in that position. But the UFC doesn't always go in that pecking order. So yeah, I think Allen would be a good option. Cannonier would be a good option. Either one of those guys.
Yeah, for sure. Gamrot got pushed aside pretty bad, man. He got Heisman'd. All right, let's move on here. UFC interim champ Tom Aspinall has been doing the media rounds post UFC 295. That's where he won the UFC's interim heavyweight title. So now he's calling for Jon Jones to be stripped of the UFC's undisputed heavyweight title and has offered to fight Stipe Miocic while Jones recovers. Should the UFC reconsider this? Why or why not? Goes.
Look, it's hard to argue with what he's saying, and from my perspective, I think a lot of us would agree with those comments. Stipe and Jon, it's just kind of lost its luster for me. It doesn't have the intrigue that it once had. And at the end of the day, aren't we trying to figure out who the best is, right? Well, isn't that the point of all this? Isn't that why we're here? Stipe versus Jones to me doesn't answer that question. Aspinall versus Miocic gets us closer to the answer, and I like that. Aspinall versus Jones gives us the answer to that question. So I think that's kind of like what separates MMA from other sports, right? Like these types of things happen and they really just put mud in the water. It makes things uninteresting. I don't like that we have to go through this route. The only thing I would disagree with a little bit is I don't think he needs to be stripped, but I would like to see that matchup happen, him and Stipe, and then Jones gets the next guy, and that's that. But the whole Jones Miocic thing, I just don't understand it. Like I get it on paper, it makes sense. As a business, I'm sure they're going to make a lot of money off of that. But I don't know that everybody looks at things that way. They just want to be entertained and they want to find out who the best is. And if you want to find out who the best is, it's got to be Aspinall versus Jon Jones. If you can't make that happen right away, then Aspinall Miocic, that's fine for me. That's a lot of fun. I'm in.
Okay. How about you, Nolan? Should the UFC reconsider? Remember, their stance is Jones versus Miocic when Jones is healthy, or go this route of what Aspinall's proposing, him versus Miocic, stripping Jon Jones. This would be for the undisputed, or even maybe like Go says, just make it an interim champion title defense while Jones isn't stripped. I don't know. It's a lot I threw at you, but what do you think, Nolan?
I think everybody just needs to kind of take a deep breath and chill out a little bit here. For me, Jon is only going to be out for, what is it, through June or something. So I think given his stature in the sport, given his championship status now, if there's any setbacks, if there's any sort of further delays, any further injuries, then yes, we can start looking at stripping him. But I think at this point in time, to just kind of call for a guy to be stripped because you don't like the next matchup that's going to happen in that division and you don't want the division to be stalled seems like kind of an unfair burden for Jon. So I wouldn't do that. If they want to run the interim fights, it's a weird scenario, right? Like it's kind of ugly to have somebody be defending an interim title at the same time as an undisputed title. But to keep everybody active, this is an imperfect situation. And I think for me, I don't think you should be stripping Jon at this point. In fairness to Stipe, in fairness to Jon, that's going to be the fight that's next. Let Tom, in fairness to Aspinall, let him fight, keep active, fight again, defend that title, get some pay-per-view points, and then set up have people talk about this for another year, anticipate, and then have the winners fight each other.
Now, was that for us, or should Tom Aspinall take a deep breath and relax because they were his comments?
No, just everybody in general. I feel like there's been a lot of hate towards the like Aspinall just won. I know it was a quick fight, but it was just I feel like there's been like this tremendous amount of attention towards the Stipe Jon fight as if it's something that Aspinall needs to fight like next month. I mean, at this point, the UFC is already booked through March, so Aspinall would be returning in April at the earliest. So I mean, if Jon's going to be 3 months later than that, I don't necessarily think that should necessarily warrant somebody getting their title taken.
Aspinall just texted me. He says, "Have you ever been fingered by a British MMA fighter?" Nolan, watch your words there. All right, Danny, did we get your take yet? What do you think, man? Where are you on? Are you on board or what?
Look, this whole situation is weird because if Jon Jones is supposed to return around July, August, right? That seems to be the time frame that the UFC says. It could take longer, who knows? But that seems to be the minimum time frame. It would be okay if they wouldn't strip him, but okay, then you fight the interim champion. That makes sense. But if you're just gonna preserve Stipe Miocic, make that fight then, and then look at Tom Aspinall be fighting sometime in early 2025 against Jon Jones, if at all, right? Because we don't even have any guarantee that Jon Jones or Stipe, whoever wins, will stick around after that fight. It just seems kind of bizarre that you were going to put somebody that clearly has a lot of hype, skilled fighter, huge for a specific market, obviously in the UK. It's kind of weird that you're just going to shelve him for, well over a year. I think he should have fought Stipe Miocic. Like Stipe Miocic should have fought at UFC 295. That was the move. That's why you have a backup opponent, so you can fill in whoever drops out. In this case, Jon Jones, and it should have been Stipe and Sergey, but it didn't happen. So what do you do now? Well, it's a tough one to answer, but I don't like the current expectation of we're just gonna preserve this Miocic and Jones fight. I think somehow you gotta involve Aspinall in there. He's got a belt. look, Renan Barão defended his interim title. I thought that was fine. Sure, it's a little weird to see it, but why not? Let's make Stipe Miocic versus Tom Aspinall sometime in early in the first quarter of 2024, and then then we make that Jones fight with whoever it is, whether it's Miocic or Aspinall. I think either or will be quite big.
And early 2024 is UFC 300. I think it's scheduled for April. That would be pretty big. We wish Jones could be a part of it, but he's injured. King James says Jones in the chat. You can come in through Facebook or YouTube. He says Jones can literally fight anyone he chooses upon return. This is true. Brian John says, what's the point of him holding a belt if he can defend it? Kepsa says Miocic versus Aspinall is a fight to make until John is back and can defend the interim. They did it before, like Danny pointed out. Renan Barão did do it. M. Patton Rummel says screw Jones. Man, you're leaving us in the dark, dude. We really don't know what your point is here. Mark England says, how long do you hold up the division? If you can't defend the belt, drop it. Yeah, that's some people do feel that way, but we got to move on. Let's get to some of this other stuff. Conor McGregor, he posted on X during a fan Q&A that a fourth Dustin fight is a must. Poirier responded telling ESPN he wouldn't mind shutting up McGregor, quote, once and for all. But he doesn't see the point. Does this need to happen? Yes or no? Nolan?
No. I mean, if it happens, great. Like, I know Conor is a weird guy to match at this point. Who knows exactly what's going to be next, if it will be Chandler, if it will be somebody else. For me, I would say the only reason this fight needs to take place one more time, or should take place, or could take place, would be because both these guys are hard to match. I mean, even Poirier's in a weird scenario right now, right? Like, what do you do with them? So I don't hate it on that, but I don't think like there's any sort of question that there's unfinished business or anything. I think it's something we've seen obviously 3 times before. So if there were options for both of the guys involved and we could go in different directions, I think that would be the best move, at least from my viewers and the fan inside me,
Mm-hmm. Danny, instead of asking you, does it need to happen? I think Nolan makes a good point. It probably doesn't, but should it happen? Like, is this too big of a sell? Are we railroading Chandler here? I mean, he put in his time as a coach and he's been pretty patient. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't like that fight. They had 3 fights and Poirier won the last 2 and quite convincingly. I think we have a pretty good idea of who the better fighter is at this point. So why do a 4th? I think if anything, McGregor should be trying to entice free agent Diaz back into the UFC. I think that's the fight that needs to happen above any other fight before McGregor or Diaz retires. Like that, there's unresolved business there. And if you ask about genuine beef and bad blood, that's the fight way more than the Poirier one. And honestly, it's a far more favorable matchup for McGregor to beat Diaz than it is to beat Poirier. So I don't know why he's pursuing that Poirier fight so bad, but I guess that's McGregor. But yeah, I don't have a ton of appetite to see that fight. I would obviously watch it because it's Conor McGregor's return, and hell, like Dustin Poirier is one of the most exciting pound for pound fighters in the history of the sport. But as far as like a storyline and what they can draw between each other, like I kind of feel like that's already over with. We already saw that. So I would like to see McGregor move on to other matchups with whatever time he has left in the sport. I think the Holloway fight would be amazing. A rematch, bringing back Diaz. Heck, if you can bring back Masvidal, I think that'd be huge as well. Chandler, obviously, I think that's a very interesting fight as well. I'm one of the weird guys that have been clamoring for this fight, but I think a fight between McGregor and Bobby Green, that's the shit right there. So I think there are so many fights out there for him that are far more enticing than the Poirier one.
Hadn't thought of the Green fight, but that would be pretty legit. Goes, I guess Danny does have a point. He does. 2-1 is kind of a once and for all. So are you on board with this or not?
I'm not on board with it. I don't think it needs to happen. It's but it's one of those situations where if they made it, it's only going to take you a couple of minutes before somebody says something or somebody does something and you're right back into it, right? It's something you'd pay for, you'd want to watch, but it just doesn't need to happen. It's kind of an insult to Michael Chandler at that point. I mean, they've strung him along for the longest time, right? The whole tough season. What's the point of all that if we're not going to get that payoff? I think that's the fight that needs to happen. But yeah, I would much rather look to other fights before I would look at this one again. Part of the intrigue when Conor McGregor fights is the smack talk and everything he says. Like, what can you possibly say? You're down 2-1 to the guy, right? Like, You don't have a leg. Well, no pun intended. You don't have a leg to stand on as far as the argument goes. So how are we supposed to get pumped up for something like this? Like, give us a Chandler fight. Give us something fresh. I think that's a better fight.
You planned that one, didn't you, Goes?
No, that's why I stopped myself halfway through.
Oh, all right. That guy's been through a lot, man. All right. Look, let's move on here. We spent a lot of time early on, and I want to circle back one last time we have a chance. I'll make this quick. Aljamain Sterling teased the fight, right? He wants to possibly debut at 45. It's tough to make weight. He's not in the title picture right now. We know it's Vera versus O'Malley, and then, of course, his teammate Davalos really has to be in the mix somewhere. So he's saying him versus Max Holloway, and Holloway's frozen out of featherweight because he's lost 3 times to Volkanovski. What do you think of this potential matchup of the former champions? Yay or nay, Danny?
I mean, will I watch it? Yeah, of course, but I'm not really about it. I've been clamoring since Holloway got iced out with those 3 losses to Volkanovski to move up to 155. So I would love to see him do a fight at 155, but heck, at the same time, like Ilia Topuria is fighting Volkanovski, we don't know what the hell is going to happen between those two. I think that's there's a chance to see an upset there. So maybe Max Holloway does have some life at 145, and I'm kind of underestimating him as far as being a champion once again. So this could be a placeholder fight. Look, I'm not going to hate it. I'm not going to sit here and hate on it, but I think there are better alternatives out there.
Mm-hmm. Frozen like Elsa saying the winner fights the winner of Volk versus Ilya. You know, it reminds me of Usman and Shamaev of the winner fight. It's like, oh man, we're just putting a fight together here, and you're disrupting a whole division of quality candidates. So it's a great idea. I love the outside the box thinking.
Who's on the line there? Who's in the line there, George? I get it. At middleweight, there's a bunch, but at featherweight after Ilya.
Well, see what I'm saying though is I guess just because a Cater or an Emmett or someone drops a key fight, I don't think it just all of a sudden puts you behind these other guys that come in and just have a great, matchup. Like, because part of being a contender, part of I guess getting frozen out is you might go 5-0, lose 1, and then all of a sudden someone goes 1-0. Is that really better than what you've kind of been doing? I don't know.
That's fair.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm not totally against it, but it just kind of reminded me of Shamaev versus Usman, where like, hey, yeah, I love the title implications, but at the end, once we had the come down from the event, we were like, wait, what are we thinking here? We got a lot of potential candidates at middleweight. But all right, Goes, let's answer this question though. Are you into Sterling versus Holloway?
I'm not. For me, look, I think Aljamain Sterling is perfect at 135. I think that's his strongest suit. Same with Max Holloway, 145. Stay there. I don't want to see you at 145. I just feel like these matchups don't really solve anything. And if you're Aljamain Sterling, like, you think Sean O'Malley hits hard, bro? Max Holloway hits a lot harder. Like, that is a really, really tough matchup. I don't know why he wants to do that. I don't know what it proves. I think I get a little upset sometimes with the UFC too, because I think fighters are kind of forced into these situations that are trying to fight for a belt and get their shots, and they don't get it. They're forced to kind of look into these crazy scenarios just to make more money when they should be chasing the belts.
Because remember what we said about Allen? You get past Whitaker, you're it. Maybe that's how Sterling's looking at it. I get past Holloway. That's the ultimate gatekeeper. But all right, Nolan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I dig it. Again, it's not totally ideal. Like, it's not a fight I need to see, but I think if Holloway's, dead set on sticking at 145, and Aljo obviously has talked a lot about how the weight cut down to 135 was not friendly, particularly at the end. I like this better than, like, say, the options it seems like they were giving him, which would be Calvin Kattar. He mentioned too, I think, on his podcast that there were 2 other people that he was friendly with. So he said he didn't want those options, which, like, looking at who's available, I know Bryce Mitchell and him are pretty tight. And also I think he's trained with Dan Ige. So, like, if those are the sort of names that they're offering him for his featherweight debut, I totally understand why Aljo's trying to fast track to the top at 145. For Holloway, it gives him another name to put on a resume. Like, I don't know who else in that division, right, you could give him that he hasn't already beat, or that is someone that really would do much for him. But to beat a former bantamweight champion, one of the greatest bantamweights of all time, and really solidify himself as the thing we already know, which is that he's kind of the guy, besides Alexander Volkanovski at 145. I think there's stuff to be gained from both guys, for both guys.
Yeah, Mozart Evloev hasn't lost. Yeah, Rodriguez just came off a title shot. And then Arnold Allen, I think he's only got 2 losses in his career. So there's a few killers out there. They just need to rebound. I like the matchup. I just don't like it with title implications. All right, just a couple minutes of overtime. Let me give you guys one last chance. The huge news today, PFL acquires Bellator. We kind of went over this at the beginning, so we're not going to regurgitate everything. If you're just tuning in, this show's available immediately after it's over. Also, it's available on podcasts. It's released on Tuesday. But if you want to watch us, because obviously we're some stellar fellas over here, then as soon as it's done, by liking and subscribing to the channel, you can get to the immediate replay, see the participation in the chat, and all that good stuff. And we do this every Monday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. But we started the show with the big news. The PFL has acquired Bellator. Final thoughts on that. We'll go around the horn. Nolan, any new info or any final thoughts that maybe you glazed over the first time?
No, I mean, fascinating times. I think we'll have a lot more to talk about, almost like a better perspective on it this week or next week than we did this week, just because this was very raw. This was all coming in at once. But I think it's an exciting time for the media. I think it's an exciting time for the fighters. I think it's an exciting time for the promotions, the landscape. Like hopefully a lot of the Bellator behind the scenes people, it seems like, at least from what's out there, they're going to be at least taken care of for at least the time being. I don't know how many or who or whatever, but it seems like this is a good experiment for MMA at this point in time. So I'm just interested to see what happens. And again, next week, I think we'll have wrapped our head around it a little bit more.
Goes, you lived through Pride in the UFC, Pride in the UFC, UFC and WEC, and the UFC and Strikeforce. It's been about 10 years since we went through one of these. Are the juices flowing?
A little bit. I mean, you have to remember, as great as Pride and UFC was, there were matchups that we didn't get to see that we probably would have wanted to see. But I think this is going to be fun. I think this is going to end up being a good thing for the sport.
Mm-hmm. Danny Segura, the last word is yours.
I'm excited. I'm excited because the future just has so many more possibilities. And I think there is a good opportunity here to create a really, really strong number 2 and have an actual reliable second option to fall back on for quality MMA and entertainment. Not that Bellator and PFL weren't by themselves, but I think together, I mean, you just multiply their power. So I'm excited, man. I'm looking forward to it, and I remain optimistic that this will be good for the MMA industry.
Yeah, and MMA Events Vlog said something nice here at the end. Maybe we'll finish with that. Respect to Coker and staff. It was an era, and all I can say is to PFLator, moving forward, there's no excuses for a crappy card. You guys got some really quality fighters between both rosters. Don't spread yourself so thin that we skip a card because it wasn't good enough. I mean, stack these babies, and put some pressure on the UFC, and then that'll raise everyone's levels. Folks, thanks so much for tuning in here. We do this every Monday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. We hope to see you next week. We'll have more information, I'm sure, about this acquisition, as well as PFL 2023. Their title, their 6 titles. It's this weekend. It's on Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. And we'll be back to unpack and react to that. And happy Thanksgiving to all of you here on behalf of MMA Junkie. Take care and go out and be a champion.